Foster a culture of forgiveness. Forgiveness brings healing and reconciliation. Choose love, not hatred. As the Lord is kind and merciful, so should we be forgiving toward one another. Our forgiveness is to be without limit and so reflect Christ's eternal love. He alone is Lord. Welcome to the homily 24th Sunday in Ordinary Time. This Sunday Gospel passage, Matthew chapter 18, 21 to 35, offers us a lesson on forgiveness, which does not deny wrongdoing, but recognizes that human beings created in God's image are always greater than the evil they commit. St. Peter asked Jesus, "Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him? As many as 7 times?" To Peter, forgiving the same person 7 times already seemed the maximum possible. And perhaps to us it may already seem too much to do so twice. But Jesus answers, "I do not say to you 7 times, but 70 times 7, meaning always, you must always forgive." And Jesus confirms this by telling the parable of the merciful king and the wicked servant, in which he shows the inconsistency of the man who was first forgiven and then refused to forgive. The king in the parable is a generous man who is spurred by compassion, forgives us an enormous debt. The king in the parable is the image of God who loves us with a love that is so rich in mercy as to welcome us, love us, and forgives us continuously. Number 7 denotes completeness or fullness. Therefore, is forgiveness limited or unlimited? Matthew has 5 discourses: Sermon on the Mount, Mission Discourse, Parable Discourse, Community Discourse, Eschatological Discourse. Last week and this week, 24th Sunday, the Gospel passage, Matthew chapter 1 to 35, comes from Community Discourse. The parable of the unforgiving servant illustrates the importance of forgiveness and mercy within the community. The king forgives the servant's enormous debt, mirroring God's forgiveness of our sins. God's forgiveness is the basis for our forgiveness of others. The unforgiving servant's behavior. The servant, after being forgiven, shows no mercy to a fellow servant with a smaller debt. His action represents a failure to extend the forgiveness he received. The importance of practicing what we preach in forgiveness within the community is very vital. In the first part of the parable, the situation of the debtor, when we speak about the king, Jesus is thinking of God. A servant owes the king 10,000 talents, that is, 164 tons of gold. The servant says he will pay. But even if he worked the whole of his life, his whole family, children, he would not be able to pay or acquire 164 tons of gold to pay back to the king. In other words, we shall never be in a position to pay back our debt with God. 164 tons of gold is massive, which is impossible. The second part of the parable, the great contrast. A fellow servant owes him 100 denarii, that is, 30 grams of gold. There is no comparison between 164 tons of gold and 30 grams of gold. A grain of sand and a mountain. Before God's love that forgives freely our debt, but just that we should forgive a debt of 30 grams of gold. What is important here is, in God's forgiveness, we are nothing compared to the 30 grams of gold. The shameful attitude of the forgiven servant who will not forgive strikes even its fellow mates. They report to king, and king acts accordingly. He puts into motion the procedure of justice, and the forgiven servant, who in turn would not forgive, is thrown in the prison till his debt is paid. This is how my Father will deal with you unless you each forgive your brother from your heart. The only limit to free mercy of God, who always forgives us, is a refusal to forgive the brother and sister. 70 times 7. Jesus eliminates any possible limitation to forgiveness. Not 7, but 70 times 7. Because there is no proportion between the forgiveness we receive from God and forgiving our brothers and sisters. Jesus' reply to Peter is very clear. This parable is of limitless forgiveness. In words of Gandhi, the weak can never forgive. Forgiveness is the attribute of the strong. Why did you refuse to show mercy on the poor? Asked the king. Because the debtor was mean. He failed to see God's immense mercy and love. He operated from transaction perspective. He was failed to be transformed. The behavior of the debtor represents a failure to extend the forgiveness he received. The servant, after being forgiven, shows no mercy to fellow servant with a smaller debt. Don't forgive your enemies for their sake. Do it for your sake. A married couple was going through a rough time. In the process, they both said and did things that hurt one another deeply. But with patience and commitment, they worked things out and began moving forward, but not completely. One day the wife complained, "Why is it that you keep bringing up my past mistakes? I thought you had forgiven and forgotten." "I have forgiven and forgotten," said the husband, "but I don't want you to forget that I have forgiven and forgotten." When someone hurts us, it's very difficult to forgive and to forget. This is what makes today's gospel so challenging. Jesus is relentless in his insistence that do not forgive people once or 7 times, but 70 times 7. In marriage, every day you love and every day you forgive. It's an ongoing sacrament, love and forgiveness. If we do not forgive others, He will not forgive us. And what are we to make of that strange, violent verse at the end of the Gospel, where Jesus shows that our Heavenly Father will hand us over to the torturers unless we forgive our brothers and our sisters from our hearts? What is this about? Whatever happened to a compassionate and understanding God? For it is not telling us what God will do, but in fact, what will happen to us if we do not forgive. If we refuse to forgive, we will live in torment unless we change our minds. But the simple human truth is this: when we have been injured deeply, we can never recover until we forgive. When someone hurts us, it's very difficult to forgive and to forget. Forgiveness is not pretending that everything is fine. Let's understand what forgiveness is and what it is not. It's certainly not putting ourselves back in the same situation where we can get hurt again. But what forgiveness is, realizing that we cannot change the past and refusing to let what we cannot change control us. Because if you refuse to forgive, we choose to feed our hurt. That hurt can grow and deep and compound with anger and hatred that rule our lives and hold us captive. Forgiveness doesn't change the past hurt, anger, and experience, but forgiveness doesn't change the future. We have the hope, we have the trust and surrender in God. Forgiveness is the giving and so the receiving of life, says George MacDonald. Oh, please just give me a chance, said the debtor. Feeding a hurt will destroy us. What happens in our life is not always fair. It is not always right. But if we want to be free, if we want to be at peace, if we want to live, we must forgive our brothers and sisters from our hearts. The best thing to give to your enemy is forgiveness, to an opponent mercy, to a friend compassion, to your children a good example, to yourself respect. Forgiveness is your gift to yourself. It's about you letting go and choosing not to allow another to have power over you. Give yourself the forgiveness. Let go. Let hurt, anger, resentment may not take power over you. Choose love and say no to hatred, resentment, and hurtful experience. Just hours after his 6-year-old daughter was gunned down in Sandy Hook Elementary shooting, Robbie Parker bravely stood in front of cameras to publicly forgive the gunman that took his daughter and 26 other lives. With a trembling voice and tear-stained face, he offered the statement on forgiveness. We would like to offer our deepest condolences to all the families who are directly affected by the shooting. It's a horrific tragedy, and we want everybody to know that our hearts and our prayers go out to them. This includes the family of the shooter, and I can't imagine how hard this experience must be for you, and want you to know that our family and our love and our support goes out to you as well. It continues. As we move on from what happened here, what happened to so many people, let it not turn into something that defines us, but something that inspires us to be better, to be more compassionate and more humble people. A real example of forgiveness. Another example of forgiveness: in the fall of 2006, the unthinkable happened when one room school full of Amish children were taken hostages by Charles Carl Roberts IV. After a few terrifying hours, Roberts bound, then shot 10 girls, killing 5 of them before turning the gun on himself. Within hours, the Amish families immediately began extending their forgiveness to the gunman and visited his wife and parents to offer them comfort. They even attended the killer's funeral. A grandfather of one of the murderous girls cautioned the family not to hate the killer. "We must not think evil of this man." Another father said, "He had a mother and a wife and a soul, and now he is standing before a just God." Matthew chapter 18 deals with the community discourse, the relationship that exists in the community. This warns against the destructive nature of unforgiveness and the potential harm it can bring to the community. So how do we foster community application towards forgiveness? Foster a culture of forgiveness. Encourage community members to be quick to forgive and slow to hold grudges, following Jesus' example of boundless forgiveness. Continue to teach about God's grace. In our life and community, let's emphasize that of our forgiveness of others rooted in God's forgiveness of us. This understanding helps us to cultivate a spirit of gratitude and mercy. Practice forgiveness workshops. Time and again organize workshop discussion groups within the community, in the parish, to help members to understand the process of forgiveness and its importance. Accountability for unforgiveness. Create a supportive environment where community members can hold each other accountable for any lingering unforgiveness. Restoration and healing. Focus on the healing and reconciliation that forgiveness brings, promoting unity within community. Model forgiveness. Leaders, shepherds, pastors, influential members of the community and the church should lead by example, showing forgiveness in action. Regular reminders. We need to incorporate the gospel teachings on forgiveness into communities' regular gatherings and reinforcing their importance. Matthew chapter 18 verse 21 to 35 offers vital community instruction on the practice of forgiveness. Embracing boundless forgiveness rooted in God's grace can lead to a more harmonious and spiritually thriving Christian community. Let's entrust ourselves to the maternal intercession of the Mother of God. May she help us to realize how much we are in debt to God, and to remember that always, so that our hearts may be open to mercy and goodness. Foster a culture of forgiveness. Forgiveness brings healing and reconciliation. Choose love and not hatred. Spread more love than hate. In the words of Martin Luther King Jr., I have decided to stick with love. Hate is too great a burden to bear. Matthew chapter 18, 21-22, Peter approached Jesus and asked him, Lord, if my brother sins against me, how often must I forgive? As many as 7 times? Jesus answered, I say to you, not 7 times, but 77 times. God bless.